الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Bulugh Al-Maram and still discussing matters or a hadith that you have mentioned in Kitab Tahara, and we're discussing in specific where he titled Bab Tayammum. So discussing matters regarding Tayammum. So today inshallah ta'ala in this session that we'll read another of those hadith that have been mentioned by the author Ibn Hajar alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala regarding of the ahkam of Tayammum. So read the hadith and then we'll go through explain the hadith and the ahkam that can be taken from the hadith. تفضل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد. Hadith 113, narrated Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu. Two men set out on a journey, and when the time of Salah came, they had no water. They performed Tayammum with clean earth and prayed. Later on, they found water within the time of the prayer. One of them repeated the prayer and ablution, but the other did not repeat. Then they came to Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam and related the matter to him. Addressing himself to the one who did not repeat, he said, "You followed the Sunnah, and your prayer was sufficient for you." He said to the other, the one who performed the ablution and repeated, "For you there is a double reward." Reported by Abu Dawud and An-Nasa'i.
No, so this is the hadith that the author, Hafidullah Ta'ala or Rahimahullah Ta'ala, have mentioned in this matter pertaining of the ahkam of Tayammum. So he have rated the hadith as stated there, and Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu قال خرج رجلان that في سفر فحضرت الصلاة وليس معهما ماء فتيمما سعيدا طيبا فصلى ثم وجد الماء في وقت فعاد أحدهما الصلاة والوضوء ولم يعد الآخر ثم أتي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فذكر ذلك له فقال للذي لم يعد أصبت السنة وأجزاك صلاتك وقال للآخر لك أجر مرتين رواه أبو داود والنسائي. So this is the hadith that Ibn Hajar I've mentioned, Rahimahullah Ta'ala, I've mentioned in this chapter regarding al-wudu, and he mentioned this particular hadith regarding what it covers regarding some of the ahkam of tayammum. So as for what we'll be discussing as the system that we follow, first would be takhrij of the hadith, then after takhrij of the hadith, which will include discussing the aqwal of the ulama pertaining to the hadith, and also we'll discuss the meaning of the hadith. Then we'll discuss the masahil, and then we'll discuss the benefit of the hadith. So in this hadith, as we have covered before, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, a Sahabi al-Jalil, so we won't be mentioning, we won't be repeating what we have mentioned regarding Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, as we have discussed him previously. So as for this hadith, that the first of those things that we'll mention is at-takhrij. So takhrij wa ukum al-ulama al-hadith. So what the ulama have mentioned regarding this hadith, and also what they have cited as the source of this hadith. So of those who have mentioned the hadith, that they have stated this hadith as mentioned by Ibn Hajar, the hadith in the Abu Dawud in his Sunan, An-Nasa'i in his book Al-Mujtaba. Then also they mentioned the hadith can be found in Darussalam in his Sunan, At-Tabarani fi Al-Mu'jam Al-Awsat, Bayhaqi, Hakim in his book Al-Mustadrak. So these are of those sources, and also so these are of the sources that I mentioned this hadith. So we have mentioned Abu Dawud and An-Nasa'i. Also the hadith can be found in the Al-Bayhaqi wal-Hakim. Also they mentioned Ad-Daraqutni. Also Ad-Darimi in his Al-Jami' or Sunan, and others who have mentioned this hadith. So that's the sources that have mentioned this hadith. So here the author, he mentioned only two, but we have added others regarding the source of this hadith. So as for the next matter to be covered, so that's concerning al-'azw al-hadith ila al-kutub al-musnada. Then by mentioning the hadith, refer the hadith back to some of the books of hadith. The next matter, what have been mentioned by the ulama regarding this hadith. So he mentioned the hadith in the Abu Dawud and An-Nasa'i. So if we were to go back to this particular hadith, that you find the ulama, there's a difference, a discussion between the ulama of hadith regarding this hadith, of those who hold the hadith to be authentic and those who hold the hadith to be daif. So we can somewhat in brief go through what is mentioned here by the ulama. So the ulama, that they have three matters that are discussed regarding those who have criticized this hadith. and mention a hadith, it is daif, or it have weakness. So of those different dimension of the three ilal of the hadith, they have mentioned that in it is one narrator who's mutakallim fi, that one of the narrators who's, there's some discussion regarding him. Then also there's a discussion regarding hadith, is whether the hadith it is mawsul, going back to the Prophet ﷺ, or the hadith it is mursal. And then we have the next matter where there's al-mursal, the hadith, it doesn't have a full connected chain. And the third matter they discuss regarding the hadith, fihi inqita, that there's a breakage also in the isnad. So these are what is covered and mentioned regarding this particular hadith, whether it be authentic or not. So the first of those things that I mentioned, they state regarding concerning the hadith, we said that there's 3 points that are raised regarding this hadith, or criticism regarding this hadith. Of the ulama, they mentioned that of the narrator in this hadith, that where this hadith, that it is narrated by min tariq, of the tariq, Abdullah ibn Nafi, and Layth ibn Sa'd, and Bakr ibn Sawada, and Ata ibn Yasar, and Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhu. So so this particular hadith, they mentioned that this narrator, as we mentioned, that we have stated, Abdullah ibn Nafi. So Abdullah ibn Nafi, who's Abdullah ibn Nafi ibn Abi Nafi Sa'iq al-Makhzumi. So this narrator who's Abdullah ibn Nafi, that there's some discussion regarding him. As well, so of the ulama who have criticized this narrator, we have Abu Zur'a, as stated regarding this narrator, La Basbi. Or La Basbi. That is, La Bas is a general narrator. So of those that are La Bas, also the same thing has been stated by An-Nasa'i, La Bas bihi. You have that Abu Hatim al-Razi have stated, Laysa bihafiz. That is not of those who's a hafiz. Then he mentioned, وَهُوَ لَيْن fi hifzi. That, is of a medium level regarding his hifz, is of some weakness, is of a level of in his memory. وَكِتَابُهُ أَصَحْ. But his writings, his books, that they are more authentic. So then he mentioned also that Ibn Hajar have stated regarding the particular person, that Ibn Hajar in his book At-Taqrib, he mentioned Thiqa Sahih al-Kitab, that he said to be Thiqa Sahih al-Kitab, that is Thiqa, and his book is considered to be authentic. وَفِي حِفْظِهِ lean, and also in his memory there's lean. So Ibn Hajar mentioned Thiqa Sahih al-Kitab, وَفِي حِفْظِهِ lean. So meaning that Thiqa, it goes back regarding his adala. So Thiqa, it goes back to his adala. As for the matter regarding his hifz, that he mentioned that, and his book is more correct. But also as for his memory, then there's some is not to a satisfactory level. So his hifz is not to a satisfactory level. So of a medium level. So, and also they stated regarding concerning this particular narrator, that of the ulama who have criticized regarding concerning, mentioned that قَدْ ضَافَهُ يعني al-Bukhari Ahmed. So this narrator, Abdullah bin Nafi, that Imam al-Bukhari and also Imam Ahmed, both all have da'afahu, have all him to be daif. So that's concerning the aqwal of the ulama regarding that particular narrator. So they mention that what is mentioned by Ibn Hajar, of some kind of more inclined toward the view of Ibn Hajar, as he give a summary in his book Taqrib. So the book At-Taqrib of Ibn Hajar, he give a summary of the narrators of Kutub al-Sittah. So they mentioned that according to Ibn Hajar, view regarding these narrators, they mentioned that Thiqatun Sahih al-Kitab fi hifzihi lean. So that's concerning that particular narrator, who's Abdullah bin Nafi. The next of those things that are criticized regarding the hadith, that of the ulama who the hadith to be mursal, and those who the hadith to be mawsula. So of those who the hadith to be at a full chain, going back to the Prophet ﷺ, and those who mention the hadith, that is the narration of a tabi upon the Prophet ﷺ. So the hadith is mursal, it has a breakage in the isnad. So on this discussion regarding this matter, that the ulama have mentioned this particular criticism of the hadith, this particular criticism of the hadith. So they mentioned that of those of Abdullah bin Mubarak and others who have narrated the hadith from narrated hadith, that it is mursal, to the extent that Abu Dawud, when he mentioned this hadith, so Imam Abu Dawud, that when he mentioned this particular hadith, that he states regarding at the end of the hadith, he mentioned that that he states that Abu Dawud ولم يذكر Abu Sa'id, that of those who mentioned that, they did not mention Abu Sa'id. So Abu Dawud he mentioned بيان أن غير النافع وهو عبد الله ibn Mubarak ويحيى ibn Bukhair. So those two other narrators other than Ibn Nafi' that he mentioned قد روي هذا حديث and late Ibn Sa'd بسنده إلى العطاء ibn Yasar mursala. So some of the ulama will hadith that is mursal is the more correct version, and we have others who have mentioned the hadith that it is mawsula, as some have mentioned. So you have that discussion between of the ulama regarding the hadith, regarding is it of a full chain going back to the Prophet ﷺ, or there's a mursal. Majority of the ulama more inclined toward the hadith that is mursal. And as we mentioned also that they have mentioned that with this particular hadith that afsamu all that there's an inqita between they mentioned regarding Bukhair ibn Sawada and Layth ibn Sa'd, or An Yasar and Ata ibn Yasar. So of those who all that there's an inqita between regarding this particular hadith. So overall that they mentioned that there's either inqita, a breakage in isnad, or a hadith is mursal or mawsul. Majority regarding the hadith it is mursal, not of a complete chain going back to the Prophet ﷺ. And the third, those who criticize this narrator, was Abdullah bin Nafi'. But overall, that you have that discussion between the ulama regarding this particular hadith. So you find that the result of the ulama that they differ on this matter. So of those all the hadith to be like da'if, this isnad. We have Abu Dawud, all the hadith to be da'if, where he mentioned, Abu Dawud mentioned, وقد ذكر أبو سعيد al-Khudri في هذا حديث ليس بمحفوظ هو مرسل. That the mention of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, it is more that's not the more, that's the more correct version is without him being mentioned. So Abu Dawud, all that, the more correct version of the hadith is that it is mursal, not that Abu Sa'id al-Khudri is not mentioned. Then also you have Darussalam, who also he mentioned regarding تفرد به Abdullah ibn Nafi' and Layth بهذا إسناد متصل وخالفه ابن مبارك وغيره. So he mentioned that, indicating that of this narrator that you find that regarding this that Abdullah ibn Nafi' that you have gone against others narrators who all the hadith to be mursal, but Abdullah Nafi' all the hadith to be muttasil. Then he mentioned that Musa ibn Harun فيما حكى محمد ibn Abdullah عبد الملك ibn Ayman عنه رفعه وهم من ibn Nafi'. So they mentioned that of the ulama who have mentioned that the one who have mentioned hadith upon the Prophet ﷺ, then that is wahm. Rafa'ahu wahm. That's an error. Min ibn Nafi'. And the one who made the error, ibn Nafi'. So also Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani also kind of somewhat more that I've mentioned that when I mentioned that more inclined to the hadith also being mursal. Also it mentions regarding concern Tabarani, when he mentions hadith called لم يروي هذا حديث متصل إسناد إلا عبد الله بن نافع تفرد به مصيبي عنه. So I mentioned that, you know, that this narration also, that a critique of this narrator of this narration. So you find that that's the aqwal of the ulama on this hadith. You have Hakim, I've mentioned هذا hadith, يعني Hakim in the book Al-Mustadrak, he mentioned هذا hadith صحيح على شرط شيخين. That according to Hakim, that is hadith is sahih on the condition, according to the condition of Bukhari and Muslim. Fin Abdullah ibn Nafi', then he mentioned Abdullah ibn Nafi' thiqa. That is person Abdullah ibn Nafi' thiqa. Then he mentioned فقد وصل هذا إسناد عن ليث وقد أرسله غيره. That then he mentioned that this narrator Abdullah ibn Nafi' it was thiqa, that he mentioned the hadith with upon Layth without complete isnad, but they mentioned that others have mentioned the hadith, which is, they mentioned that with an incomplete chain. Of the things that ulama have mentioned regarding, after the statement of Al-Hakim, then Ibn Abdul Hadi, when this hadith is mentioned, that he states regarding this hadith in his book at Tanqih, he mentioned ta'aqqabahu Ibn Abdul Hadi. So Ibn Abdul Hadi, that he has somewhat, and in his book Al-Muharrar, so in his book Al-Muharrar, that Ibn Abdul Hadi, when he mentioned this hadith in this bab of tayammum, mentioned وفي يعني what I've mentioned by al-Hakim في قوله تساهل, that I've mentioned by Hakim, that is hadith according to the condition of Bukhari and Muslim. He said that is him being somewhat very lenient in passing that judgment. Then I mentioned that, and this is based upon Al-Hakim and others who take the rule regarding that they follow this condition regarding قبول زيادة الثقة مطلقة. So Hakim, in his book Al-Mustadrak, he followed this principle that زيادة الثقة, any type of additional information mentioned by a narrator that is ثقة, then it is مقبولة مطلقة. Which, as we are discussing books of in ilm al-mustalah hadith, that qaida, there's some discussion and clarity, and not as mentioned regarding that in every case ziyad al-thiqa, it is maqbula. Then it mentioned that the person needs to look at the qara'in regarding this matter. But overall, that's the aqwal of the ulama pertaining to that hadith. So that's the aqwal of the ulama pertaining to this particular hadith. And of contemporary Shaykh Albani, or the hadith to be sahih, or then you find the likes of Arnahout mention that ما صرح بتفسير الحديث, that didn't explicitly mention the hadith being authentic, which is Shuaib Arnahout. So aqwal of the ulama regarding that hadith, majority of the ulama, all this particular hadith is daif, but some may incline toward the hadith being Hasan because of shawahid of the hadith of Ibn Abbas. But I mentioned hadith of Ibn Abbas also, it is under criticism based upon what narrated in the hadith Ibn Layya. So Abdullah ibn Layya was also heavily discussed and criticized by the ulama, or back and forth, but the ulama awlat ibn Layya, that in reality is true hal, is true condition, that is daif because of his hifz. Then so that's of the first point regarding the hadith, somewhat so overall the hadith mutakallim fi, between the ulama, majority may incline toward the hadith being daif, but others who all the hadith to be Hassan with it shawaid. Allahu a'lam. As for what is mentioned regarding per se the hadith, meaning of this hadith, that they mention the Prophet ﷺ when he said concerning hadrat as-salat, يعني كان دخل وقت الصلاة, so the salat have entered, فعاد أحدهما الصلاة والوضوء, where one of them that he mentioned that he repeated, so both of them prayed in at-Tayammum. One of those narrators that they mentioned that he repeated is salat after making al-wudu. Then it mentioned that the person who repeated his salat, that he did so either out of dhan, based upon he believed that what he did before was invalid, so the salat he prayed in tayammum, but he found water still within the time of that salat, so he repeated his salat based upon he believed or thought that that salat was invalid, so he needed to repeat it, and that is why he did the second one, or he did out of ihtiyat. So either believing the first salat was invalid and then needed to be repeated, or he did so ihtiyat, he did so out of being cautious because he had found water. Then the Prophet ﷺ mentioned asabta as-sunnah. So one of the persons said asabta as-sunnah, meaning wafaqat al-hukm al-shar'i bil-kitab was-sunnah. So the person who mentioned the Prophet ﷺ to the one of them that asabta as-sunnah, that's the one who did not repeat his salat, that he mentioned that that person, that is salat is valid, that and you're in line with the Sharia, that what you did is in line with the Sharia. Then he mentioned that as for the second person, for call, that for the other person, I mentioned that there's mentioned laka ajr marratain, that the other person who repeated his salat with wudu, again he mentioned that as for you and what you did, that you receive reward twice. The ulama mentioned regarding that, and the person receive reward twice. One, reward for the first that he did in the state of tayammum, so that in dry ablution, that the salat is still valid. And as for the second salat that he did by repeating, because they found water after they have prayed, but time still remain, so he repeated salah. The time for that salat, it still was in, so he repeated salat and he made wudu and then repeated his salat. So the Prophet mentioned that that they mentioned that one also is considered to be the person that what you did of doing the second salat, that was out of your ijtihad. So you're rewarded for your ijtihad. So you're rewarded for your ijtihad, but the first one that you did initially, that was valid. That was valid. The second that you did, that was out of your ijtihad, and because the mujtahid, and if you make an ijtihad, then he's rewarded once for it, he's rewarded for its ijtihad. So they mentioned that, so that's concerning that particular meaning of the hadith. So the hadith here, it discussed regarding, of this matter regarding ahkam tayammum, that two individuals, that they were in safar, travelers, that the time of the salat have entered, so they prayed that salat, and they're without water. So they performed tayammum. They mentioned Sa'id and Tayyiba, that as we discussed concerning Sa'id al-Tayyiba, the ulama, they mentioned as Sa'id al-Tayyiba, that has to be something that is from the earth, either the dirt or the of the earth, or the so things of the earth. Then that they mentioned that is what is intended. Of the ulama who mentioned that who see that as Sa'id al-Tayyiba, they see it much more general, which is anything that is above on the earth, the surface of the earth. That so anything the surface of the earth, then they say that you can make tayammum from it. So they'll see the person that, whether it will be a tree that may gather dust, they see it as a wall, a building, they see it as anything on the earth, so from the earth or anything on the earth surface. So that's concerning that matter. Then the Prophet ﷺ did mention that both individuals pray, and eventually they found water before that salat time came to an end. So one repeated salat and the other did not. So as for the ahkam that can be taken from this hadith, that the ulama discussed concerning one, the first of those masail, that if a person was to perform tayammum, either from, because of they need to perform Hadith al-Asghar or Akbar. So the person who is required to perform Tahara, whether it is for matters relating to Hadith al-Asghar or Akbar, but a person who performed did tayammum because they needed to perform a tayammum, being a state of Tahara, then they prayed. Then after praying, that they found water was found. But the time is still in. The time for that salat is still in. They mentioned that in that case, does the person repeat his salat or no? They mentioned أنه لا يعيد الصلاة. The person in that case, because he has ended the salat, then after he has ended the salat, water was found, but the time of that salat is still in. The person, he prayed dhuhr at 12:30, but salat al-dhuhr, it ends at 4 o'clock. So the person prayed dhuhr at 12:30 in tayammum because there was no water present. Then after so pray at 12:30 dhuhr, at 1:30 water was found. And dhuhr, it ends, the time ends at 4 o'clock. Does the person is required to repeat the salat or repeat the salat or not? The ulama mentioned that, the person does not need to repeat his salah. They mentioned does not need to repeat the salat. And the Prophet mentioned asabta sunnah. The Prophet mentioned that asabta sunnah wa adzaka as-salatik, and also you are rewarded for your salat. Mentioned that it is sufficient for you. So they mentioned that even though we have a discussion between the ulama on that matter, but they mentioned that you have a narration on Nafi and Ibn Omar anhuma, tayammum wa salla al-asr, that Ibn Omar, that he prayed salat after performing tayammum, and the salat was asr, وبينه وبين المدينة ميل or milain, and between him and Medina was a mile or two. فدخل المدينة والشمس مرتفع, that when he entered Medina, the shams was still up, the time was still in. Then I mentioned ولم يعد, and he did not repeat his salah. So Ibn Umar رضي عنهما, that prayed asr, by the time he arrived in Medina, when he prayed in tayammum. When he arrived in Medina, meaning that he have access to water, but he did not repeat his salat, and the time of asr was still in. So they mentioned that it shows that there's something which is that the person does not require to repeat his salat. And that author of Ibn Omar in the Sunan al-Bayhaqi. So they mentioned that, and that's the call taken by Jumhur of the ulama. That Jumhur of the ulama take the position the person does not need to repeat his salat. If he was to pray in tayammum, the salat have ended, but the time still remains and he has found water, he does not have to repeat his salah. So they mentioned that, and that's the view taken by Imam al-Arba, Imam Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi, Ahmed ibn Hanbal, alayhim rahmatullah, jami'an, and also al-Fuqaha as-Sab, or most of the ulama as-Sab of Medina, Sa'id ibn Musayyib, Omar ibn Zubair, Qasim ibn Muhammad, and the rest of the mention al-Fuqaha al-Medina as-Sab'a, that they also is of this view the person is not required to repeat his salah, and what he did is sufficient. So that's the view that is taken. There's a second opinion on this matter, that qawl thani, it wujid al-ma fi what, that the person was to find water within the time of salat, even though he have prayed, but he has found water and the time for the salat still remain. Then I mentioned that he added to salah. The person should repeat his salat. The person have to repeat his salat, and that's the qawl that is said to be the view that is taken by Mahkul, Ashami, Ata, Ibn Sirin, and others of the ulama who have taken that view. And overall, that they mentioned that al-qawl al-awwal wa qawl al-rajih, that the more correct view is the first opinion, that the person is not required to repeat his salat because he has done what he was commanded and instructed, which is that he was commanded to pray in a state of tayammum. He did so as instructed by the Sharia. And the Prophet ﷺ that he somewhat, and this particular hadith, that the person, he tell the person that asabta sunnah, that you have fallen in line with the sunnah. Also this matter regarding as-salat in a state of tayammum, that ulama mentioned that yes, the person might fall into certain circumstance. So regarding tayammum and how it relates to salat, that the person might find himself in 4 situations. The first of those situations, that the person, and yajid al-ma, that the person have found water after completing his salah. وَبَعْدَ خُرُوجِ الْوَقْتِ. So in this case, the person prayed in tayammum, ended the salat, and that salat have ended, the time have ended, and then after he found water. So dhuhr, he prayed at 1 o'clock. And did not, and when he ended, and he prayed in tayammum. At 4 o'clock, water was not found. So the time of dhuhr have ended at 4 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, he found water. So in that case, there's no, as Allah mentioned, ijma, that a person does not repeat his salah. In that scenario, there's an ijma that a person, as mentioned by Ibn Mundhir, that a person, and also Ibn Qudama, the person does not repeat his salat. So the person prayed while in tayammum, completed his salat, the timing for that salat also ended, then later on, after that time, he found water, there's no repetition of his salat, and ijma between the ulama. The second case, and yajid al-ma ba'da salat wa qabla khuruj al-waqt, that the person that he prayed his salat and he found water before that time before that salat time came to an end. And we have mentioned a discussion before that there are 2 aqwal between the ulama. Those who the person repeat his salah because the time still remained and water is found, while others that he does not repeat his salah. So we have discussed another qawl of jumhur of the ulama. Then the third state that we have mentioned regarding this matter, the third case that they mentioned, that a person, he found water qabla dukhul fi salah, that a person had no water. Water was not available. Then right before the person, he performed tayammum, and he's about to pray the salat. They call the iqama. The iqama is called, and they're about to make the salah, but they haven't entered into the salah. The iqama is called, they're about to enter, then someone says water is found. So in this case, what to be done? In this case, they mentioned that in this case, for sahih, that in this case, ishkal, that the person need to go and perform wudu with water. In this case, the person need to not enter into salah, but rather the person is required to make wudu. He's required to pray wudu. And if he was to pray, la yujzi, his salat is not valid, because he prayed in Tayammum when water was available. And it is mentioned by Ibn Mundhir قال أجمع عوام أهل العلم. Ibn Mundhir mentioned أجمع عوام أهل العلم that the vast majority of the ulama have agreed على أن من تيمم ثم وجد الماء, the one who performed tayammum then find water قبل دخوله في الصلاة, before he entered the salat, even before takbir. He's about to make the takbir, but water is found. The person, they mention أن طهارته تنقض, that is tahara, it is of tayammum, it is invalid. وعليه أن يتطهر ويصلي إلا حرف روي عن أبي سلمة. So they mention that the person need to go and perform wudu and then pray, except for they mention that a harf, a view that is mentioned by Abi Salama. But overall, عامة العلماء, awam al-ulama, that the person in this case is not to pray because he hasn't entered the salah. So the adhan, the iqama is called, they're about to pray, and in the state of tayammum, he hasn't said Allahu Akbar, is not to enter the salah. And he shouldn't pray except he have go and make wudu with water, then he will pray. As for the fourth case they mention, أن يجد الماء وهو في إثناء الصلاة, that a person performed tayammum and he has entered in the salah. He's in the second rakah, third rakah, but he's in the salat. He has entered the salat, إثناء الصلاة, while in the salat, but he hasn't completed his salah. Then I mentioned, so someone mentioned that water is found. What is to be done in that case? So the person while in salat is in a state of tayammum, but then during the salat before he ends, water is found. Water returns. Water was gone and now it has returned. In that case, the ulama, they have a khilaf between themselves. There's a khilaf between the ulama. Of the ulama who mentioned that عليه أن يقطع الصلاة, that a person while in the salat and water is found and he started salat in the state of tayammum, he need to break his salah and not continue his salah, but rather break his salat and perform wudu and come back and pray salat from the start. And that's the method of Imam Abu Hanifa, or Riwayah and Ahmed, also qawl that is taken by Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri in his book Al-Muhalla. So they are of this view. As I mentioned, that tayammum batalat wujuh biwujud al-ma, that the asl for them is that tayammum becomes invalid with the presence of water or the availability of water. So if water is available, then tayammum becomes invalid. It is invalid. And so they mentioned that's the case concerning in that case the person needs to repeat his wudu and also his salat. And they mentioned last part, they mentioned that in Surah Al-Ma'idah, where they mentioned فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَتَيَمُّمْ. So I mentioned that فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, that if you did not find water, that then perform tayammum. So they mentioned that the condition, if you did not find water is not present, then you make use of tayammum. If water is present, so the maf'um is mukhalafa. If water is present, you're not allowed tayammum. Or water is available, you're not allowed tayammum. So they mentioned from this that the person's salat becomes invalid. And also the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the hadith of Abu Dawud and An-Nasa'i, where he stated, فَإِذَا وَجَدَ الْمَاءِ, if the one has find water, فَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهِ, then the person should fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَيَمَسُّ بَشَرَتُهُ, and the person that he should wash his body limbs with this. So they mentioned that show that the person is to discontinue his salat, break his salat, perform wudu, and then start his salat, the first view. The second opinion on this, أن عليه أن يكمل صلاته, that a person should complete the salat and not break it. ولا يقطع, and not to break his salat. So the person, in the second view, the person should continue with his salat, complete his salat. So he's in the salat, perform rakatain, 2 rakah remain. For example, the person should complete his salat and not break it. And that's the call of Imam Malik and Imam Shafi alayhim rahmatullah ta'ala, and Riwayah Imam Ahmed. So it's the call of Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, and also Riwayah and Imam Ahmed. And they can somewhat take the view of a person that when he entered the salah, he entered in tayammum, and this was in line with the Sharia. So the Sharia allowed him to start his salat, commence his salat, because of the absence at that time of no water. So he was allowed to pray without water and by using tayammum, and he did so. So the fact that he has started the act, then he should complete. He started the act, he should complete that act until the end. So that's concerning those views that are there regarding that matter. The ulama mentioned, of those who have explained Bulugh Al-Maram, that most of those are of those who are more inclined towards the first opinion. So the first opinion, min bab al-ihtiyat, at least, that a person go with the first opinion, which is if the person's in the salah after making tayammum and water is found while he's in the salah, then the person should break his salat, go perform wudu, and then return and pray salat from the start. That's the ahwat arja aqwal, between the aqwal of the ulama on this matter. They mentioned a next matter regarding tayammum. In this matter, they mentioned that, as mentioned by Fat al-Alam, he mentioned ayyuhuma mukhtar. Which of these are the better thing to be done? Which is the more preferred thing to be done? Ta'khir at-tayammum or taqdeemu. So the person wants to pray, time for salat, there's no water available. Should the person wait and delay his salah and see if he finds water, give himself more time to find water, or the person, he just pray then? So which should he do for? Delay the salat in hoping that he might find water, or the person is allowed to commence his salat? So on this matter, they mentioned that they mentioned arba aqwal of the ulama. Ta'khir at-tayammum. The first view, that ta'khir at-tayammum awla bikulli hal, that it is always better for the person to delay his tayammum in all cases of the salah. And that's the call of Ata, Hassan al-Basri, Ibn Sirin, al-Zuhri, Ahmed, al-Thawri, wa Abu Hanifa. So there's a call of that they prefer for the person to delay his salah, to delay the salat, ta'khir at-tayammum, and wait and see if the situation might change. So that view, Ata, Hassan, Ibn Sirin, al-Zuhri, Ahmed, Thawri, and Abu Hanifa, alayhim rahmatullahi ta'ala jami'an. That a matter that we just add, that of the ulama al-Shafi'iyah, and the matter we discussed before regarding that, they mentioned that they make a distinction regarding that the person praying. I will leave that. We discussed that again next time. So regarding concerning the matter, they mentioned the second opinion is that istihbab at-takhir. So those who mentioned that it is preferred for the person to delay salat in raja wujud al-ma, open at the person, open to find water. So they mentioned it is preferred for the person to delay his tayammum and the salat, open that he might find water. And that's the view of Imam Malik wa Abi Khattab al-Hanbali. So Abi Khattab al-Hanbali, istihbab at-takhir in raja wuju' al-mal. So but if the person wa in yais min wujudi, the person believing is not going to find water, then I mentioned that is mustahab for him to pray as early as then he pray at his earlier time. So the person fear that he may not find water, then pray in its earliest time. And that's the view of Imam Malik. So make a distinction regarding the person believes he will find water, delay. But if you believe that, no, I'm not going to find water, then pray at its earliest time. The third opinion mentioned taqdeem afdal. That is for the person always to make tayammum and pray at its earliest time. They mentioned إلى أن تكون واثقا بوجود الماء في وقت. Except the person that I feel certain, have that much confidence that you will find water within this time. So the person have that confidence, that's the other person. So that's concerning of the view that is taken by some of the ulama. And the fourth view they mentioned taqdeem afdal mutlaq. That for the person to pray this, make tayammum, bring forward tayammum, or pray time in its earliest time, then that's always best, and not to delay. So to pray earliest time and not to delay, then I mentioned that is for all the salat, then that is for them, that is always the preferred choice. And that's the view taken by the Zahiriyah, and amongst them Ibn Hazm. So the Zahiriyah, Madhab Zahiriyah, and also the view of Ibn Hazm, that they mention, as part of the mention, وَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ, that to be hasty in doing of good. وَسَارِهُ إِلَى مَغْفِرَةٍ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ, that also you to be hasty and speedy in seeking the reward, the forgiveness from your Lord. So they mention that for the person to hasty and be quick in doing of good deeds, that's always encouraged. So it's always encouraged for the person to pray at his earliest time, which is taqdeem, at-tayammum and salat, according to that view. And also they mentioned in Ibn Thabit and Ibn Umar, as we mentioned before, أنه tayammum, that Ibn Umar, Ibn Khattab, anhuma, that he was outside Medina and he performed tayammum and prayed Salat al-Asr. Then upon entering Medina, he still had time and found water, but he mentioned that, and he didn't repeat the Salat. So they mentioned, he was more quick in performing the Salat and not delaying. So those are the aqwal what they use regarding this particular matter. So they mentioned that that qawl of those who mentioned that they're more inclined towards the fourth opinion, taqdeem at-tayammum afdal, except they mention, except as I mentioned, except in those cases where it is preferred at times to delay that salat. So like Salatul Isha, the person can delay because there's nusus, there's text regarding delay Salatul Isha. So in those cases, a person can take up that concession, and also in the time of concerning that severe hard, ibrad al-har, when things are very hot, then a person also can delay, as those time is preferred for the person. Delay is salat in general, so the person can delay is salat and also tayammum in those cases that it is allowed. But overall, that the person should do so in its earliest time. And also regarding al-jam bain salatayn, that a person can delay because of combining between two salats, so he may delay. So those that said, overall, it's preferred to bring forward to pray in its earliest time, but in certain times that the Sharia allows to delay the salat, one can do so. So that's concerning of the aqwal of the ulama regarding this particular matter. So that inshallah ta'ala, that we have covered most of the masail of this hadith. Then we have just a few fawaid. So the fawaid of this hadith, it shows in brief regarding concern that, it shows regarding the permissibility of mashru'iyat at-tayammum liman lam yajid al-ma. So it shows the permissibility of the person who does not find water to make tayammum. Also it shows the ijtihad of the Sahaba during the time of the Prophet Islam. So ijtihad of the Sahaba. So those Sahaba were out there in a journey that and they made ijtihad regarding praying their salat upon finding water. So they made an ijtihad. So and then but they mentioned it is allowed for the Sahaba and to make ijtihad during the time of the Prophet Islam, but in his absence. So the Sahaba ijtihad would be done in the absence of the Prophet Islam, not in his presence. And also in the case of his absence, the Sahaba, that they'll return back to him regarding these matters to get his clarity. So also it shows regarding the Talib al-Ilm, or not a person of that level of the major Mashaykh of Ahl al-Fatwa, that the Talib al-Ilm not to have opinions except he checked with the ulama. So it was if I find himself in a situation that he may come up with a view, but he should run it by the ulama and not be too independent in having his views that are not reviewed by the ulama. And also it shows regarding the talib in something that is something that he may study also, that he may find a matter which is somewhat that is very complicated matter, regarding certain matter that needs some more clarity for him to return back to the ulama. To return back to ulama on complicated matters that he may find to him may need a little more to be reviewed and to be cross-checked by the ulama or those who are senior to them. And also the person act bil al-ahwat, so the Muslim acting which he think is more safer. So the person repeated salat thinking that was more safer for him. So that are of the benefits that can be taken from this particular hadith. So that inshallah ta'ala will end this segment or this session. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل والآخر دعوانا الحمد لله آمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. right